Hey guys, welcome back. Today I'm going to be going through my exact drawing process whilst we draw Glinda from Wicked. I have tried to set this video up so that you guys can draw along with me if you want to. The link to the reference is in the description below, and so is a Procreate file with the sketch that I have prepared for you earlier. Alright, so let's get started. So the first thing that we're going to do is to change the background colour. The reason that I do this is because the white background can be really harsh, and because of colour theory, it can make the colours look so much more contrasted and harder to make accurate. So to give you an example, a blue line against a white background looks way too contrasted compared to a blue line against a grey. So as this character has a lot of orange, peach and pink tones, so a lot of warm hues, I should be using a green-blue complementary colours for the background to create a nicer contrast. This process is called underpainting because I am literally painting on the lowest layer of the canvas. If you're not sure what I'm referring to, or if you need a quick refresher on colour theory, check out this video up here. So yeah, I should be going for a teal colour for the background, but for this portrait, I'm gonna go with the grey. I'm breaking this rule of colour theory. That's because I know myself, and I know that my eyes are gonna get so overstimulated and therefore too tired with so many bold colours on the screen, and I kinda wanna film this video in one sitting. Use colour theory as a guideline, not as a rulebook. That really changed the way that I saw my art. Art theory is important, but so are the brushes. Use the theory as a vessel to bring the brushes to life. It's this balance that makes my digital art have a traditional oil painting feel. So for this piece, we're going to be using the textured brush from Marsa's free Procreate brush pack. I'll put a link to it in the description below. I've increased the minimum size in properties to be able to really see the grain of the brush. And just to let you know, I use the same brush for the sketch. Okay, let's move on to the undertone. The undertone is a colour that would act as a foundation to the rest of the piece. So we have our highlights and we have our shadows, and in the middle we have our midtone. We're going to be using this midtone as the undertone. Blocking your colours out in this way is a good way to just add colour for the sake of adding colour. It's easier to make a start when there's already something on the page. If you were asked to paint this portrait with no undertone and go straight into the shading, it will be so much harder to get the accurate values as depicted in the reference. So for this portrait, we're going to go for a peachy orange undertone. A good way to see if this value is the right value is by desaturating your page. Colour pick your undertone and compare it to the midtone of the reference. So remember, the midtone is the colour between the highlight and the shadow. If the values look the same or at least similar, then you're good to go. Great, so we're ready to start. I always find it easier to start with the shadows first, so let's go ahead and do that. So it's a shadow, so we know it's going to be darker, so we need to go down this way. We can see that the shadows, especially over here under the cheekbone, look more saturated, so we need to go across this way. We can also see that it looks quite rosy and a little bit red under the cheekbone, so we're going to go back this way. So let's go ahead and saturate, darken and redden the undertone value to create the shadow. Alright, so let's check if this is correct. Let's desaturate our page again, colour pick the shadows in the reference and let's compare it to ours. If it looks the same or at least similar, we can go ahead and start adding the shadows. So we can see that the light is coming from this side, and this side of the face is in the shadows more. So I'm going to focus on this side of the face for now. So I'm going to go ahead and add the shadows under the cheekbone, along the hairline, side of the nose, wherever I see a shadow. If you're finding this difficult, desaturate your page once again to see your values on the reference, and then just add the grey where you can see it on the reference. I'm just going to focus on the head and upper neck for now because this is the hardest part to get right. This is probably also a really controversial opinion, but I don't think you need to know human anatomy at this stage anyway. For now, let's just match what you can see on the reference. Once you're ready, we can move on to the highlights. So we can see that the highlights should be somewhere over here in our colour palette. So to get there, we need to understand that the highlights are brighter, less saturated, and in this case, peachier. Again, let's check. Desaturate the page, colour pick from the reference and compare it to ours. If it looks the same or at least similar, let's go ahead and add our highlights. I know I said earlier that I'm only going to add shadows to the right side of the face, but now I'm going to add the highlights wherever I see it on the face. The reason I do this is because it's easier to pick out where the light is falling on a reference, especially this one, but it's a little bit harder to find the specific shadows, especially around the eye over here. So if we add the light, we can see where the shadows might fall into place. Okay, so we have three very strong tones here. the highlights, midtones, and the shadows, and it seems that I've already made a mistake. If we look at the reference, we can see a very nice gradual change in tone, but if you look back on our drawing, the midtone looks very dull in comparison. The midtone looks brighter in the reference than it does in our drawing, so let's fix that. I'm going to make it brighter, less saturated, and a little bit peachier. And now I'm just going to use this to go over the midtone that we've already laid out. It might look a little bit too orange right now, but we've only just started the ugly phase, so let's just trust the process. Alright, so I'm a self-taught artist, so my terminology might not be 100% correct, but I like to call this next phase the transitional stage. This is because we are going to be creating some really nice transitions between the highlights, the midtones, and the shadows. So we'll be creating the smooth gradients of colour, just like what we can see on the reference. The best thing about digital art is that we have so many tools available to help us. That includes the colour pick tool. Now before you start panicking, just hear me out. I will not be colour picking from the reference. I don't believe in that. I think that's cheating, even if you're a beginner. Instead, I'm going to colour pick from my own drawing. Let me show you what I mean. So you see this rough line between the midtone and the shadow between the jawbone and the cheekbone, right? Well, I'm going to be colour picking between those two colours. So remember when I said earlier that brushes are just as important as the theory, right? The benefit of this brush is that it's full of tiny little grains, kind of like a very thick pencil. We can use these thick grains to overlap two colours because in between we will see its transitional tone. So the colour that will help shift from midtone to shadows. So we have our highlights, we have our shadows, and the midtone is a transitional tone between light and dark. And between the highlights and the midtones and the shadows, we have even more transitional tones. The more transitional tones that you have, the smoother the gradient from light to dark. But in this portrait, we want to go for a traditional oil painting feel, so we don't want the portrait to be too smooth. Okay, so let's go ahead and add some transitional tones. You might find that some of your colours look a little bit muddy. To fix it, it's probably either too dark or too unsaturated, so just keep shifting it until it looks a little bit more vibrant. Also, keep in mind that this is realism, and the reference tells us that some of the colours are a little bit muddy because of the lighting. A good example is the side of the forehead right here and the side of the eye. It might look muddy, but it could even be because you've used too much of it like I have, so just go back and add some more shadows. Again, this is a really good practical example of just drawing what you see, putting the theory down aside for just a moment and literally just focusing on the page. So you know how we can see that this part looks flat, this part looks curved, and this part is flat again? Add more transitional tones between this area to get the feeling of the curve in the cheekbone. You can also add as many transitional tones as you want to. There's no right or wrong answer. I mean, if you really wanted to, you could leave it at this stage and move on to the rest of the drawing. I mean, if you really wanted to, you could just leave it at this stage and move on to the rest of the drawing. But it won't be realism, it will be somewhat more stylized. So the more transitional tones, the more realistic it will look. Okay, now this is the part where I hand it over to you. I want you guys to apply what we've learnt from the face and do the same thing for the neck, the torso and the arms. So ignore her hair, clothes and her hands. So just as a reminder, establish the shadows, establish the highlights, and if the midtone needs brightening and saturating like what we did earlier, do that as well. You can do this stage by stage if you find that easier. So if you want to do the neck first, then the collarbone, then the torso, whatever, that's fine, however you feel comfortable. But don't forget, a lot of the colours that we have already laid out for the face will be, if not the same, then extremely similar to the colours for the rest of her skin. So if you want to colour pick from the face that we have painted, not the reference, then go for it. I did. Alright, once you've done that, I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit so we can move on to the hands. Hands look scary, but I promise you that they're actually a lot easier than you might think. Don't think of it as a hand, okay? Think of it as 4 worms, or 4 arms, or 4 bent cylinders. pretend they're anything except for fingers, and I promise you it will make it easier. Alright, so let's start again with the shadows. According to the reference, the shadows look desaturated, grey and a little bit muddy, but we want our Glinda portrait to be full of colour and life. So let's ignore the colour in the reference and colour pick a burnt red or orange that we've already used in the shadows of her face and her body. I'm going to fade the shadows just a little bit to make it easier to see the highlights that we're going to add in just a second. Alright, now so let's add in our highlights. I'm only going to be putting the highlights on the really bright parts of the reference, and then we'll use transitional tones to create a nice gradient between the light and the dark. This area still looks a little bit flat to me, so I'm going to add some darker shadows where the wand would be behind her fingers. For now, anyway. Alright, so we're going to move on to her hair. But before we do, I'm going to quickly erase the midtone from her eyes so you can see the grey from the background coming through. And I'm also going to block out a pink for her lips, her dress and the wand. I want to do this now because it will help us to the right level of blonde as per the reference. Okay, so let's go back to the hair. Blonde is, in my opinion, the hardest hair colour to paint. The reason that I say this is because there are so many different types of blonde, and there's also so many different colours in blonde hair. You can get platinum blonde strands to deep brown, and if you're not careful, her hair can end up looking very yellow. A good trick that I like to use is by blocking out the hair undertone in either a chocolate brown or a chestnut rather than yellow, because brown is easier to build on top of and will give us more contrast against the blonde that we'll be adding very shortly. If we go straight for a yellow undertone, it will be harder for us to evaluate whether the colours that we are laying on top of it are the right colours, because it's just going to look like a sea of yellow. I'm going to use the same brown colour for her eyebrows and her eyes as well. Alright, so we can clearly see that her hair is not brown, but if we overlay a blondish colour directly on top of this darker one, the contrast will be way too high. So here comes in our temporary transitional tone. Let's add in a medium brown directly on top to give us a transition between brown to blonde. And now we can add in a very pale beige orange, not yellow. I'm just following the direction of the hair strands, so the hair is falling down this way, and then we have a large curl coming across here. Immediately we see blonde, or at least the start of a blonde. Alright, so now let's add a new layer directly above the sketch layer, and I'm gonna merge the sketch layer together so we have more layer space. Alright, so it's time to start rendering. You're probably gonna be asking, haven't we already been rendering? And yeah, okay, we sort of have, by adding consistent transition tones, but now we're going to be adding the final level of detail on her skin. This is one of my favourite parts of the process because it can completely transform a piece from making it look stylized or semi-realistic to fully realistic. So let's start with her face. I'm going to choose a dark grey colour for her eyelashes, eyeliner, and we'll change the brush to a smaller textured brush. I'm mainly going to be going over the outer corners of her eyes for the eyeliner because if you can see in the reference, the inner corners of her eye are pretty light. I'm also going to be adding a bit of colour to the creases in our eye socket so they're a bit more visible like in the reference. Now, if we move on to the rest of her face, it's actually a little bit easier because we have already done the hard part in the previous layers. We just need to add some more transitional tones to cover up the sketch layers. And you're probably thinking, why don't we just hide the sketch layers instead? And you absolutely could, but personally, I don't think we're quite ready to just yet. By colouring over them, we're creating even more nicer, smoother transitions or gradients across the face. I got asked this question recently by Chaos on Havoc on YouTube, and one of the questions they asked me was, how do you know what to keep tight and what to keep loose in a drawing? When we say keep tight, we're referring to areas that show the most detail. If you've seen some of my previous art, you'll notice that a lot of my pieces have a lot of detail and focus in some areas and less detail in others. And so the answer is actually pretty simple. Wherever you want more detail. I like to call them points of interest. So this could be the face, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the eyebrows, surrounding facial hair or hair that frames a face. Point of interest could even be something in the hand or some sort of gesture. Anything that helps to guide the eye through the portrait is a point of interest. So these points of interest will be kept tight. Everything else can be as loose and messy as you want to. The way that I would keep it tight is by adding loads more transitional tones in between. The same goes for this portrait, although I would argue that having some knowledge of anatomy and just art theory in general at this stage would be helpful, so let's just keep going on with the transitional shades. Try not to press too hard. The lighter that you press, the smoother the transitional tone, and the more it will look like an oil painting. The harder that you press, the harder the transition between the tones, and the more it will look like an acrylic painting. There's no right or wrong way to do this, it's just based on the kind of vibe that you want to go for. Personally, I really like the oil painting look, so I'm just going to carry on pressing lightly. Now, while you guys finish that off, I'm going to skip ahead and start working on the eyes and the lips. The lips are pretty easy in theory. Remember to separate it with midtone, shadows, highlights. One of the biggest reasons why I really struggled to progress as a beginner was because I used to overthink every little aspect of a drawing, especially the smaller, finer details. I would think that just because the details were important to a realistic art piece, that it had to be perfect. But that's not what realism is. Realism isn't about making it look perfect to the reference. Realism is an accurate interpretation of true life. So as long as the shadows are roughly in the same place, and that the highlights are roughly in the same place too, it is still realism. Because that is how the light and the shadows will fall in real life. Does that make sense? That's why at this stage it's important to have some understanding of anatomy, but if you are a total beginner, then break down the reference and just draw what you see, don't overthink it. So to give you an example, we can see that the shadows are rounding out over here and the highlight is mainly on the bottom lip. Now I don't want to do too much to the lips because I want you guys to be able to see that it does not have to be accurate to the reference. Let's move on to the eyebrows. These are one of my favourite things to draw. Think about an eyebrow and think about how the hair moves, right? So it grows upwards on the inner part and then brushes to the side along the brow. So up and then across. We're going to be doing the same thing here. So up and across. Then use some of the transitional shades in the hair and try and mimic what you see in the reference. And once you've done that, use a skin tone to cut into the shape of the eyebrow like this. You don't need to cut into the outer part of the eyebrows, but you need to cut into the inner and some of the middle parts just like this. Just keep shaping the eyebrows until they look somewhat similar to the reference. Alright, now while you guys are finishing up the eyebrows, I've already made a start with her dress. So just to explain what I've done, can you see in the reference that the dress is moving upwards like petals of a flower? I've kind of done the same thing here. So I took this pink that we've already laid out and darkened, saturated and made it slightly redder to get this lovely red for the shadows over here. So I started off outlining the darker shadows first, then used transitional shades to get lighter and lighter. So you see how each petal, I guess, of this dress is lighter on the left edge and darker on the right. We just need to mirror it in the exact same way that we rendered the face. This is probably the easiest part of the dress. The hardest part is the rest of it, because of the way that the dress is moving. So let's do this together and take it step by step. So we can see that the material has folded this way, so the shadows are at the top, and the highlights are along the bottom towards her elbow. But let's break it down a different way this time. Let's start with the highlights first, then shadows, then we can even out the midtone. I'm not going to make this completely accurate to the reference. Everything else has been, I think, pretty spot on or very close, but realism is a lot of things, not necessarily a perfect copy of a reference, so I'm just going to make it up a little bit. So the top edge of the dress is in the light, and the dip here towards her elbow is going to be a little bit darker, and then just loads and loads of transitional colours. I kind of like the idea of it floating down in streams, so like petals of a flower. I know that the dress doesn't actually look like this, but honestly, I think this might make the dress look a little bit better. Alright, so we can see that the dress is sparkly, and a nice way to show this is by stippling. So stippling is when you use dots or small little marks to create patterns or movement in an art piece. So I'm going to be adding some darker dots over here with a transitional shade and then layering it with a highlighting transitional tone on top. Not only will it make it look like different gradients of glitter, but it will also create a really nice small subtle shadow around the glitter to create that texture. So in the areas where the dress is in the shadows, you could use glitter that is the same colour as the midtone. In areas where the dress is in the midtone, you can use glitter that is the same colour as the highlight. And in areas where the dress is in the highlight, you can use glitter that is a really bright, desaturated pink. This will make the glitter look three-dimensional and actually look like it's sparkling, like it does right here. Now, I'm going to keep going over it and I'm going to add some more dimension to it by adding lines to give the dress more texture, because personally, I feel like the dress in the reference look a little bit flat and slightly boring. Alright, so I'm sure you've already noticed that I've done part of the wand. That's because out of this entire art piece, the wand can be either the hardest or the easiest part of the drawing. But here's a trick to make it the easiest thing that you'll draw today. So all of these movements in the wand are refractions of light hitting the glass, which creates this distortion of the things behind the wand. So that's her skin tone, her dress, her hand, her hair. The reference looks overwhelming, but don't forget to break it down. There's darkness over here along the middle and there's light along the edges. Draw that in using lines. Don't colour it in by going left and right, just follow the direction of the wand. And then just keep adding transitional colours following the direction of the wand. The more transitions you add, the less it will look like glass and the more it will look like cheap plastic, so bear that in mind. We want to get the elegance of the wand, so try to use as few transitional colours as possible. Less is more. Okay, now that we've done that, let's go back and finish her hair. Now I'm going to start with the hair on the right of her and start with the shadows, not forgetting the part in her hair up here. So because we've already laid out a few brighter, lighter beige tones as a base of the hair, we can use this with the darker shadows that we've created to create some more transitional tones. If we see on the reference, it looks like the hair falling behind her is kind of split up into 3 sections and it's getting lighter the more we go right. So keeping that in mind, use transitional tones that get brighter as we move right too. Now, because the portrait that we started to build has a lot of very red, pinkish undertones, especially in the shadow areas of her skin, the hair should start to look a little red-brown on the left here too. Then it should look brunette in the middle, and then blonder as we move to the right. The reference does not tell us to do this, but it's a really nice way to make this hair look more natural blonde and part of her rather than it being dyed. Now, for the hair falling down the front here, we need to be able to do something similar. The top part here under her jawline is in shadow, so if we can make the hair just look slightly red-brown, it will help to start the transition from darkness to light. So I'm going to keep up with the transitional tones, remembering to follow the direction of the hair flow. The reference tells us that her hair is split into sections, so it's important for us to show this as well. And then again for the curl. The benefit of this curl is that we can literally do whatever we want down here, as long as we can show that the hair is flowing and curling at the end. Great! Now we can move back up to fix the hair on her head over here and do the exact same thing that we have been doing. Just remember, the highlights aren't localized to one area like it was down here. The highlights are sort of scattered across. An easy way to draw this is by following the process of dark, medium, light, medium, dark, and then with loads of transitional shades in between. I mean, you could even do medium, light, medium, dark, Don't overthink it, just pick out the patterns and draw what you see. Okay, the crown. When I first saw the reference, I was absolutely dreading this part, but now that we finally reached this stage, I think that this is pretty doable. Actually, I think this is going to be really fun. Normally when we draw crowns, we tend to use blue greys or green greys. This is because the blues and the greens are cool colours in the colour wheel and silver is a cold metal. So using cool colours will help us to feel the coldness of that metal. We can then use some whiter tones on top of it to show the depth and the sparkle. So if you look at the reference, we can see that the crown is made up of circles, spirals and stars. So let's draw some circles, spirals and stars. I'm going to start off with a few stars over here so that I can understand the scale of the crown. And now we can move on to creating some spirals. It does not have to be exactly like the reference, just follow this based on design intuition. As long as it looks roughly like this, we're good to go. Okay, so let me show you something. Let's just zoom in. At the front of the crown here, I'm drawing the stars very flat, but as we go up the crown towards the top, I'm starting to draw them a little bit bent. The reason that I'm doing this is because it helps to establish depth. So we can see this in the reference over here, how the top stars are a little bit bent at the top. Don't forget that. The crown is made up of lots of interlocking spirals and stars, so it doesn't really matter if it looks quite messy. Alright, now we need to establish shading for the crown. This is a little bit tricky because we've already gone for a very light pale blue for the crown already. I probably should have done this in a darker shade, but it doesn't matter, let's just try and fix it. I'm going to add a quick swatch over here so we can try and find the right shadow. Okay, let's darken the background a bit, like that. Okay, so now let's add another swatch for what could be the midtone. We can test it right here. So a few spirals in the midtone and then some of the highlights from our light swatch. Alright, so I'm just going to get rid of the sketch layer because I don't think we need it anymore and I've also run out of layers. Okay, so I'm going to add a clipping mask over the crown. I'm also going to increase the brush size and reduce the opacity. Alright, so here we go. So the light is coming from this direction. So let's add some of the midtone over here on the right. I actually really like the background colour as the shadows, so I'm just going to take that and add a few bits of shadows over here. But it still doesn't look shaded enough, and that might not be because of the shadows being too weak, but I think it's because the highlights are too weak. So let's make the highlights brighter. I'm not going to go for a pure white because pure white is very rarely seen in natural day-to-day life and it can overpower an art piece, so we're going to go just off a pure white. I know I want the background to be green in some way, to kind of contrast against the pink and to be a very wicked alphabet-esque. Now the crown does look a little flat against the background, so I'm going to add some dull greens in the background to show depth of the crown and inside the back of the crown, like this. I am dreading this one. I don't know how I'm going to do this, but let's start off small. I'm going to add a ball to the end of the wand, and maybe we can try and build off of this. Okay, so you know how the wand has these little sparks coming out of it? I think it'll be really fun if you could draw these sparks coming out of the wand, because it looks a little bit plasticky in the reference. We want it to look magical, so let's go ahead and add these spark thingies. We also need to remember that in the reference, these sparks are different lengths, so let's try and do that here too. I'm going to make it a little bit darker in the middle. I'm going to intentionally make it a lot darker than the reference because I want to use this wand as a guide rather than what I want to copy. Trust the process, this looks so bad. Okay, so what if we add some white over here inside the wand head and then maybe some parts flying out, maybe? And then use bloom or something to try and make this area here glow like it's made of magic. Okay, so kind of like this. And that looks really bad. Okay, let's try something else. What if we add some pink inside of it to try and make it look three-dimensional, like it's not just a round glowy thing? Yeah, okay, I don't like that either, it looks too much. Alright, so I'm just going to remove the glowy part. Oh, that actually looks kind of nice, maybe? Okay, so what if we exaggerated the shape a little bit, because it looks like a sparkly pom-pom right now. And then just sharpen the edges so that it looks like crystals coming out of the wand, sort of like in the reference. Yeah, okay, I think it looks okay for now. Let's not overthink it, let's just move on to the background. I like the idea of a blue to green fade in the background, like in some of the movie posters, so we're gonna see if we can draw inspiration from that. I'm not entirely sure what I want to do for the background, maybe something very simple and then cut into it later. I also want to quickly take this opportunity to start zooming right into the details and refining some of them, as I think some of these areas do look a little bit messy, like the chin, sides of a face over here. You can also go through and add some nicer hair strands as well, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. Alright, so now that we've done that, I'm looking at the background and I don't really like how clean it looks. So I want the background to look more paint-y, so I want to change the brush to something a little fatter and use that to create some large paint marks in the background. Sometimes I find that zooming out completely makes it easier to see what I'm doing, like there's intention to every mark that I'm making, but that's just down to personal preference. Okay, so I kind of want to create this nice border around the front of the drawing. So I'm going to use the same brush to draw some dark red paint marks around the edge. Then use soft light. Then erase some of the inner edges out so that it looks sort of blended. I also want to darken the background a little bit because I feel like it's too pale. And I think we're nearly done. Okay, now let's move on to the foreground. I want to create some wispy effects in the front. So what I'm doing is setting the page to page assist, so all the lines that I make will follow the line of this grid. There's actually a trick to this. If you turn page assist on, change layers, then turn page assist off, the grid lines will disappear, so they're not so annoying. But if you go back to your other layer, the page assist will still be turned on. It's just a nice way to hide the grid lines because they're coming in the way a little bit. And I think we might be done. So what do you guys think? I'm pretty active on Instagram, so feel free to tag me so I can see how your Glinda turned out. To be honest, I'm pretty happy with the way that this looks, although I think I could have done the wand a little bit differently, but I'm still really happy with it. My favourite part is probably the dress. Sometimes it's nice to go off script and ignore the reference and just draw what you want to draw. It can really help to create some really interesting designs and design choices, and I think it's really helped to lift her off the page a little bit more. Anyway, thank you so much for following along. If you want more videos like this, then please subscribe, hit the thumbs up button, and leave a comment on who or what you want me to draw next. If I have gone too fast or too slow in some areas, then please let me know as well. I want to be able to create videos that you guys actually want. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video. Bye.